What if the most dangerous thing a man ever did wasn't plant a bomb, or move a weapon, or give an order, but light a cigarette? What if 8 years of running, hiding, and surviving, 8 years of being untouchable, ended not because of a satellite, not because of a traitor, not because of a wiretap, but because of 40 seconds standing on a pavement in Beirut, doing something he'd done 10,000 times before? This is a story about a man who faked his own death and nearly got away with it, and about the single analyst who refused to accept that he had. His name inside Mossad's system was not his real name. It never is. The file called him the Smoker, not because anyone had confirmed his habits, because the only physical evidence linking him to a 2008 arms transaction in Cyprus, a deal that had moved shoulder-fired rocket components to a Hezbollah cell in southern Lebanon, was a partial fingerprint recovered from a cigarette filter found at the meeting site. That fingerprint was the entire foundation of the case. No photograph confirmed after 2007. No phone signature, no financial trail under any name the desk had been able to establish. Just a partial print from a discarded cigarette, a file number, and a threat assessment that described him as a senior logistics coordinator for Hezbollah's external financing network, a man responsible for moving money and material across West Africa, the Levant, and potentially into Europe. One fingerprint, one file, and a growing suspicion that the man attached to both had been dead for 8 years. His name on the desk was Eitan. That is not what his colleagues called him, and it is not what his personnel file said. But for the purposes of understanding what happened, Eitan is enough. He was not a field man. He had never run an asset in a hostile country, never sat in a parked car outside a building at 2 a.m, never made the kind of decision that ends with someone not coming home. He was an analyst. 4 years on the Hezbollah financing desk. Before that, 2 years on West African threat networks. He spoke 3 languages and read intercepts in a 4th. What Eitan had, and what made him dangerous in the specific way that analysts can be dangerous, was an intolerance for conclusions that didn't close cleanly. The file had a death report. In late 2003, a Mossad operation in Côte d'Ivoire had targeted a mid-level Hezbollah financing operative believed to be managing a network of front companies across the region. The operation had been considered a success. A body had been recovered. Forensic confirmation had been obtained, or so the file said, and the target had been declared eliminated. The file was closed. Resources were redirected. The desk moved on. Eitan had inherited the file in 2009 as background reading when he took over the financing desk. He had read it twice, flagged nothing, and moved on like everyone else. But the Cyprus fingerprint, which came in through a separate channel in early 2010, had been run against the full database, and it had returned a partial match to a profile that existed inside the closed 2003 file. A partial match, not a confirmation. The system flagged it as a low-confidence cross-reference, the kind of algorithmic noise that analysts learn to discard or they spend their entire careers chasing ghosts. Eitan did not discard it. The internal argument lasted 3 weeks. His section chief's position was straightforward. The 2003 file was closed. The death had been confirmed through established procedure, and a partial fingerprint match at low confidence was not a basis for reopening an 8-year-old case when there were active, confirmed threats requiring attention. Eitan's position was simpler. If the match was noise, it would cost them nothing to check. And if it wasn't noise, if the same physical trace was appearing in 2 separate locations 8 years apart, then either the 2003 confirmation was wrong, or someone had deliberately constructed a false death, and Mossad had accepted it without question. Either possibility, he argued, was worth 90 days and 2 passive assets. He was given the 90 days. 2 assets in Beirut, no active collection, no direct surveillance. Observe, report, escalate if warranted. 90 days to find a man who, officially, no longer existed. The first 62 days produced nothing useful. One asset reported a change in foot traffic patterns in a neighborhood in Beirut's southern suburbs, a block that had become, over several months, noticeably less welcoming to unfamiliar faces. Residents who would previously have nodded at a passing stranger had stopped making eye contact. A small cafe that had been a casual neighborhood fixture had quietly closed. This was not intelligence, it was atmosphere, the kind of texture that experienced field people recognize as meaningful, and analysts struggle to weight properly. Eitan weighted it. He requested a single physical surveillance post near the building the asset had flagged. 1 operative, 1 week. Camera only, no contact, no approach. The request cleared after 48 hours of bureaucratic friction. 1 operative was assigned, 1 week, extendable at the section chief's discretion. The operative's name for these purposes was Dov. Dov had been in Beirut before. He knew how to occupy a street without becoming part of it. The specific art of being visually unremarkable in a city where people had spent decades learning to notice the things that didn't fit. He set up in a position with sightlines to the building and waited. Day 1, nothing. Day 2, nothing. Day 3, a delivery vehicle that blocked his angle for most of the morning. Day 4, rain that reduced visibility and produced nothing of interest. Day 5, a car that had not been there before. It parked across from the building at just past 10 in the morning. A man got out. Mid-40s, medium build, civilian clothing, nothing about him that would draw a second glance from anyone who wasn't already looking. He lit a cigarette before he reached the door. Dov photographed him. 7 frames across the approach, 2 more as he paused at the entrance. The photographs were transmitted within the hour. The facial analysis came back inconclusive. The existing file photographs were 6 years old. The angle wasn't clean enough. The probability estimate was above 50% but below 70%. In operational terms, that number means nothing. You don't move on a man because there's a 53% chance he's who you think he is. The man was inside the building for 38 minutes. When he came back out, he walked to his car without stopping. The cigarette he'd been smoking before he went in was already gone, discarded on the pavement near the entrance, ground out under his heel. Dov waited until the car had turned the corner and disappeared. Then he walked to where the man had been standing. The cigarette butt was still there. It was out of the country within 24 hours. Standard procedure. An evidence pouch. A courier route that didn't pass through anything that would raise flags. A laboratory that processed the sample inside 36 hours. Eitan received the result on a Tuesday morning. He read it once. Then he sat back and read it again, because the first reading hadn't produced anything that made sense. The DNA from the cigarette butt was not a match to the target's file. It was a match, partial, but above the confidence threshold, to a profile attached to a completely separate operation. A 2003 West Africa file. The closed file. The dead man. Eitan put the result down on his desk and looked at it for a long time. Because if the DNA was right, then one of 2 things was true. Either the confirmation in the 2003 file was wrong, which meant Mossad had declared a living man dead and spent 8 years not looking for him. Or the man had known they were coming in 2003, had arranged for someone else to die in his place, and had spent the years since then operating under the protection of his own confirmed death. In both versions of the story, Mossad had been wrong for 8 years, and in both versions of the story the man had just handed them the one piece of evidence that could unravel everything. The question Eitan couldn't yet answer was whether the man knew that. The result went up the chain within 6 hours. Not because Eitan had full authorization to escalate. He didn't, technically, not on the basis of a partial DNA match from a passive surveillance posting that his section chief had approved with visible reluctance, but because the match touched the 2003 file, and the 2003 file was not solely owned by Eitan's desk. It had originated in a different division, been closed by a different director, and its confirmation report had been signed off at a level that made reopening it something that could not be done quietly. Eitan escalated because he had no choice. The moment he sat on it, the result became his liability. The meeting that followed was not comfortable. There were 4 people in the room. Eitan, his section chief, the deputy director of the relevant operational division, and a senior analyst from the West Africa desk who had been present when the 2003 file was closed. The fourth man had not been told why he was there until the DNA result was placed in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment and said nothing. What nobody said out loud, what everyone in the room understood without saying, was that if the 2003 confirmation was false, then someone had signed a report validating a death that hadn't happened. That report was still in the system. It had informed resource allocation, threat assessments, and operational decisions for 8 years. Everything downstream of that report was built on a foundation that might not exist. This was not a conversation anyone wanted to be having. The deputy director asked the first operational question: how confident were they in the DNA result itself? The laboratory had returned the match at above the operational confidence threshold, but the source material, a cigarette butt recovered from an open pavement in a city where hundreds of thousands of people walked daily, carried a contamination risk that a controlled sample would not. The DNA was present. The match was real. The question was whether the profile being matched was complete enough to be definitive. It wasn't. Not quite. It was one threshold above what the system considered significant, and one threshold below what the system considered confirmed. That gap, that single increment of uncertainty, became the fault line the meeting broke along. The section chief's position was that the gap was too wide, that acting on an inconclusive biological match against a dead man's file, based on a surveillance posting that had been approved with extreme reluctance, was not sound operational practice. That the correct response was to close the Beirut observation, submit the DNA result for further analysis, and wait for a secondary confirmation before committing any additional resources. Eitan's position was that waiting was not neutral. Every day the observation post was not running was a day the target could move, could change his pattern, could disappear again. And if he disappeared again, if he went back underground with the same sophistication he had demonstrated for 8 years, they might not find him for another decade. The fourth man, the one from the West Africa desk, said almost nothing. What eventually emerged from the meeting was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely, which in institutional terms usually means it was the correct decision. The Beirut observation post would continue for an additional 30 days. Dov would remain in position. No escalation of collection methodology, still passive, still camera only, no asset contact with the building or its occupants. In parallel, the DNA result would be submitted to a secondary laboratory for independent analysis. If the second analysis returned the same match at the same confidence level, the case for elevated authorization would be substantially stronger. Eitan accepted this. He didn't have the standing to push harder, and he knew it. But he left the meeting with a question he hadn't carried in before. If the confirmation in the 2003 file had been false, who else knew? The secondary laboratory result came back in 11 days. It matched the first result almost exactly. Same confidence level, same profile, same conclusion. The DNA on the cigarette butt was connected to the man in the 2003 West Africa file. The dead man had a biological presence in Beirut in 2011. The case was now something different. The deputy director assigned a senior operational director, a man with field experience, and the authorization level to move the operation from passive observation to active collection. Eitan remained on the analytical side. Dov remained in Beirut, and the operation, which had begun as a 90-day passive watch on a building in the southern suburbs, was quietly reclassified into something with a much longer shadow. But here is where the first assumption from Phase 1 broke. Eitan had constructed his argument on a specific premise that the target was operating in Beirut as a base, moving outward for transactions and returning. The building in the southern suburbs was, in his model, a residential or operational anchor. Find the anchor, find the man, find the man, find the network. The new intelligence did not support that model. Over the following 3 weeks, as Dov extended his surveillance window and 2 additional assets were quietly activated in the area, a different picture began to form. The building was not the target's base. It was a meeting point, used occasionally, irregularly, with no predictable schedule. The target was not resident in Beirut in any fixed sense. He was passing through it, the way a traveler passes through a transit hub. He wasn't living in any of the 4 countries they were beginning to track. He was moving between them, continuously, with a discipline that suggested he had not spent the past 8 years being careful by accident. He had been trained, or had trained himself, to never be still long enough to become a target. The anchor Eitan had been looking for didn't exist. This changed the operational calculus entirely. A static surveillance operation designed to build a pattern around a fixed location was now chasing a moving target across multiple jurisdictions. Each country required separate asset deployment. Each asset had to be managed without cross-contamination. They couldn't know about each other, couldn't share information laterally, couldn't be connected by any thread that the target's own security apparatus might pull. The operational director ran the numbers and presented the resource requirement to the deputy director. The deputy director looked at the numbers and asked the question that Eitan had been dreading since the first DNA result came back. What if they were wrong? Not wrong about the DNA, the science was sound, but wrong about what it meant. What if the profile match was real and the man in Beirut was genuinely the person connected to the 2003 file, but not the senior commander they were building this operation around? What if he was peripheral? A cousin, a former associate, someone who had shared a cigarette with the original target in Côte d'Ivoire 8 years ago and happened to carry a proximate genetic marker. Partial matches carry that risk. They always do. What if the entire escalation, the 2 laboratory analyses, the additional assets, the operational director, the reclassification, was built on a biological coincidence? Nobody in the room could fully rule that out. The abort discussion lasted nearly 2 hours. The operational director argued for continuing. The DNA match, combined with the behavioral indicators in the neighborhood, the change in foot traffic, the closed cafe, the building's irregular use pattern, constituted a convergence of evidence that was more than coincidental. The target profile, the location, the operational security posture of everyone connected to the building, it all fit. The section chief argued for suspension. Not termination, suspension. Pull Dov back, run the existing evidence through a formal analytical review, and return to the question in 60 days with a cleaner picture. 60 days, in Eitan's assessment, was approximately 59 days too many. He said this once, quietly, and did not repeat it. The compromise this time was different from the last one. Dov would remain in position for 10 more days. During those 10 days, the objective was not confirmation of identity. The objective was behavioral confirmation, evidence that the target's operational security posture was consistent with a senior commander rather than a peripheral associate. If the 10 days produced behavioral indicators that matched the profile, the operation would continue. If they produced nothing, the abort discussion would resume with a much stronger case for suspension. 10 days. A behavioral test. The operation balanced on something that had nothing to do with DNA or databases or satellite imagery. It balanced on how a man carried himself when he thought no one was watching. On the 8th day, Dov reported something that hadn't been in the brief. A second car had appeared near the building. Not at the same time as the target earlier, about 40 minutes before the target's car was observed arriving. It parked, sat for 20 minutes with the engine running, and left. It reappeared after the target's car had gone, circled the block twice, and left again. Dov's assessment? Pre-arrival security sweep. Someone checking the environment before the target came in. Someone checking it again after he left. You don't arrange pre-arrival security sweeps for a peripheral associate. You arrange them for someone whose death, if it happened in the wrong place, would cost you considerably more than one man. The question Dov sent back with his report was operational and specific. If the security protocol included a pre-arrival sweep, then the surveillance position itself had been exposed to that sweep on at least 2 occasions without being detected. which either meant they were clean, or meant the sweep had seen them, assessed them as non-threatening, and let them sit. And those two possibilities, one safe, one catastrophic, were not distinguishable from Dov's position. He was either invisible or he was already known. He had no way to tell which. The decision to move came from above Aitin's level, not because the behavioral confirmation was airtight, it wasn't. Not because the 10-day window had produced certainty, it hadn't. It came because the operational director had looked at the pre-arrival sweep report and concluded that the calculation had changed. Every additional day of surveillance was now a day that surveillance might already be compromised. The window wasn't closing. It may have already closed. Move or accept that it was over. The fourth country was chosen for 3 reasons. First, the target's travel pattern had placed him there twice in the preceding 6 weeks, the highest frequency of any location outside Beirut. Second, the operational team had existing infrastructure in the city, cover identities already in place, exit routes already mapped. Third, and most practically, it was the one location where the pre-arrival security protocol had not yet been observed. Whatever the target did to protect his movements in Beirut, he did not appear to do the same thing here. That observation, that gap in his security posture, was the entire basis for choosing this location. It was also the assumption that would nearly end the operation before it began. The team that moved into position consisted of 6 people. Dov was not among them. His face had been in proximity to the target's environment for weeks. If there was any possibility the pre-arrival sweep had clocked him, moving him into the execution environment was an unacceptable risk. The lead operative, call him Ran, had not been part of the surveillance phase. He came in clean, with a commercial cover identity and a legitimate reason to be in the city. He had done this before, in other cities, against other targets. He was experienced in the specific way that experience in this profession is accumulated, quietly, without public record, in ways that don't appear in any file that anyone outside a very small room will ever read. Rand's briefing package included the travel pattern analysis, the behavioral confirmation from Beirut, and the gap assessment. The observation that the target security protocol appeared thinner in this location. He read it twice. Then he asked the operational director a question that the briefing package hadn't answered. Why was the security protocol thinner here? The operational director didn't have a clean answer. The analysis said it was thinner. The surveillance data supported that conclusion. But the reason behind it, whether it was genuine negligence, a different risk assessment by the target, or something else entirely, hadn't been established. Ran filed the question and moved on. He had a window and a target. The philosophical question of why the window existed was less important than using it before it closed. This was his first incorrect assumption. The operation's initial timeline placed the target in the city for a 48-hour window based on travel pattern analysis. 2 days. The team would establish positions, confirm the target's presence independently, and act within that window. On day 1, the target did not appear. Not at any of the 3 locations the pattern analysis had identified as likely. Not at any location the team's assets in the city could account for. His travel had been confirmed, the entry was in the system, but the man himself was, for the first 18 hours of the window, invisible. This was not the plan. Ran through the possibilities methodically. The target had entered the country and changed his pattern, possible and concerning. The travel confirmation was wrong. A false entry in the system, a decoy, possible and more concerning. The target had entered, detected something, and gone to ground. The most concerning possibility of all, and the one Ran couldn't rule out. He reported back. The operational director told him to hold position and extend the observation window by 24 hours. 24 hours. Then a decision. The false start came on hour 20 of the extended window. One of the team's local assets reported a sighting, the right physical description, the right general area. A man who moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace the behavioral profile had flagged as characteristic. The asset was not trained. He was a facilitator, someone who knew the city and could move through it without attracting notice. His job was proximity, not precision. Rand moved 2 members of the team toward the location for visual confirmation. They arrived in time to see a man who was not the target walk into a restaurant and order lunch. Similar height, similar build, different face. The team pulled back. Rand filed the report with a single line of operational assessment. Asset confirmation is insufficient for this target. Do not move on physical description alone. This cost them 4 hours and, more importantly, cost them position. The movement to confirm the false sighting had displaced 2 team members from their established coverage points. Resetting took time. During that time, the actual target arrived in the area they had just vacated. They missed him by approximately 20 minutes. The near abort came that evening. Rand called it himself. The target had been in the city for over 30 hours. The team had failed to confirm his presence directly. A false sighting had disrupted their positioning. The 48-hour window was now a 12-hour window, and the operational conditions, the very gap in the target's security protocol that had made this location the chosen ground, could not be verified because they hadn't been able to get close enough to observe his behavior. He laid it out to the operational director without editorial. They were operating on a pattern that was at least 6 weeks old, in conditions they could no longer confirm, against a target who had spent 8 years surviving exactly this kind of situation. He recommended suspension, not abort, suspension. Pull back, reset, wait for a cleaner window. The operational director listened. Then he asked one question. If they suspended and the target made them, either here or when they tried again, was there another window? Rand didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was probably not. A man who had faked his own death once, who ran pre-arrival security sweeps in Beirut, who had maintained 8 years of operational invisibility. That man, if he became aware that a team was tracking him, would not give them another opportunity. The suspension call would end the operation. Not today, but permanently. Rand withdrew the recommendation. They would continue. The false release came at just past 9 the following morning. A second asset, more experienced than the first, with a specific task and a specific location to monitor, reported nothing. The target had not appeared at the location. The window for that particular approach had closed. For approximately 40 minutes, the operational picture was quiet. No movement, no sighting, no signal. The city going about its morning with no indication that anything was happening. Rand used the time to recalibrate, read the travel pattern. Look again at the gap in the security protocol. Try to answer the question he had asked in the briefing and never fully resolved. Why was this place different? And sitting with the pattern data in front of him, in the specific stillness of the operation that had stalled, the answer surfaced in a way it hadn't before. The security protocol wasn't thinner here because the target was less careful here. It was thinner here because this was where he felt safe. Not operationally safe, personally safe. This was not a logistics stop or a financial meeting point. This was somewhere he came when he wasn't working. The pattern wasn't lower frequency because he visited rarely. It was lower frequency because the visits were personal. He wasn't here for a transaction. He was here for a reason that had nothing to do with Hezbollah's financing network. Rand had 30 seconds to decide what to do with that information, because if the target was here for personal reasons, his behavior would be different from any behavioral profile built on operational movement. He would be less guarded in some ways. He might also be surrounded by people who had nothing to do with the operation, people whose presence created variables the team hadn't planned for. The 30 seconds passed. A team member in position on the eastern approach sent a single word to confirmation. Visual. The target was moving on foot. No pre-arrival sweep visible, no accompanying security. Walking the way a man walks when he believes the only people who know where he is are people he trusts. He was heading toward a small street market 2 blocks north of the team's primary position. The operational window was approximately 4 minutes. Rand gave the go, and then the thing happened that no briefing document had included and no pattern analysis had predicted. The target stopped walking. Not because he had seen anything, not because his security instincts had fired. He stopped because he had found what he was apparently looking for, a specific stall, a specific vendor, and he stopped and reached into his jacket pocket and produced a cigarette and lit it, standing completely still, in an open space, unaware. 8 years of survival, 8 years of discipline, 8 years of running and hiding and faking and disappearing. And here, in a city where he thought he was invisible, the habit that had found him in Beirut had followed him to the end. The confirmation of death came through the operational channel within 2 hours. Not a celebration, not a formal declaration, a single line of text in a secure communication thread that Eitan read at his desk in Tel Aviv, alone at just past midday. He read it and sat with it for a moment and then moved to the next item in his queue, because that is how this kind of work processes itself. Not with ceremony, with the next problem. The next problem arrived faster than anyone had expected. Within 72 hours of the operation, 3 financial monitoring threads that Mossad had been running in parallel, threads connected to the broader network the target had been servicing, went simultaneously silent. Not reduced, not intermittent, silent. The accounts stopped moving. The front companies stopped transacting. The courier routes that had been generating low-level signals for months produced nothing. The network had not waited to confirm the death through official channels. It had not waited for a news report, an intercepted communication, or a formal notification. It had gone dark within 3 days, which meant one of 2 things. Either the network had a protocol, a predetermined tripwire that activated automatically if the target failed to make a scheduled contact, or someone inside the operation had communicated the outcome before they should have. Both possibilities were logged. Neither was resolved quickly. Eitan was the one who flagged the timeline discrepancy. The financial threads had gone silent approximately 18 hours before the operation's existence had been formally communicated, even within Mossad's internal structure. The circle of people who knew the operation had concluded successfully was, at the 18-hour mark, extremely small. He submitted the flag as an analytical note, not an accusation. He had no evidence of a leak. He had a timeline that didn't close cleanly, and a professional obligation to document it. The note was acknowledged. An internal review was opened. The review was never formally concluded, at least not in any document Eitan was given access to. The West Africa desk lost 3 years of patient cultivation in the same 72-hour window. 2 facilitators who had been providing low-level intelligence on the financing network's regional structure stopped making contact simultaneously. A third was found to have left his country of residence within hours of the operation, destination unknown, travel documents that didn't match any identity in the system. The desk chief submitted a damage assessment that was blunt in its conclusion. The operation had decapitated one node of the network, and, in doing so, had illuminated the network's shape to everyone inside it. Everyone who had been operating under the protection of the target's oversight now knew that protection was gone, and everyone who knew that protection was gone had made the rational decision to disappear before the attention moved to them. The target had been the thread. Pulling it hadn't unraveled the network. It had caused the network to cut itself free. The 2003 file was quietly reopened. Not loudly, not with formal announcement or institutional acknowledgement. But the confirmation report, the document that had declared the target dead 8 years earlier, signed off by a director who had since retired, was pulled from the archive and subjected to a review that it had never received when it was first filed. What the review found was not evidence of deliberate falsification. It found something more uncomfortable, adequate at the time procedure, applied to evidence that deserved more scrutiny than it received. The body recovered in Côte d'Ivoire had been identified through physical description and a single corroborating witness, a local asset whose reliability rating, in retrospect, had been weighted too heavily given the absence of any biological confirmation. There had been no DNA analysis in 2003. The technology was available. The protocol did not require it. The protocol was updated quietly, with no public explanation, approximately 4 months after the operation concluded. The financing network reconstituted. Not immediately and not in the same form, but within 18 months of the operation, financial intelligence analysts tracking Hezbollah's external funding structure began identifying new patterns, different account structures, different transit routes, different front company architectures that bore the organizational fingerprints of the same network the operation had supposedly disrupted. It was more cautious. It was more distributed. It had clearly absorbed the lesson of having a single senior coordinator as a structural vulnerability and had reorganized around that lesson. The operation had not destroyed the network. It had educated it. This outcome had been predicted, in writing, by the minority voice in the internal debate, the analysts who had argued that surveillance was more valuable than elimination, that watching the target move money was worth more over time than removing him. Their assessment had been overruled. The window had been closing, the operational director had made the call, and the call had been correct by every formal metric. A confirmed high-value target had been located and neutralized. The fact that the network survived and evolved was not recorded as a cost of that decision in any official document. It was recorded as a new problem, requiring new resources, generating new files. The accounting was kept separate. It usually is. Dov went back to a different assignment. He had spent weeks in Beirut in a surveillance posture that had, on at least 2 occasions, been swept by the target's pre-arrival security protocol. Whether that sweep had identified him or simply assessed him as non-threatening was never definitively established. What was established through routine post-operation review was that his cover identity, the specific commercial documentation supporting his presence in the neighborhood, had been accessed twice by a Lebanese government database query during his posting. Who had run the query and why, and whether the results had gone anywhere beyond the initial search, unknown. Dov was not deployed to Lebanon again. Eitan received a commendation that was not placed in his personnel file. In the internal culture of the institution, this is not unusual. Recognition that appears in a file creates a paper trail. Paper trails create vulnerabilities, so acknowledgement moves through other channels, a conversation, a handshake, a reassignment to a more significant desk. Eitan was moved to a desk that handled higher-value targets. He brought with him the methodology he had developed, the tolerance for partial matches, the refusal to accept closed files as solved problems, the specific analytical habit of asking not what the evidence showed, but what it would take for the evidence to be wrong. He applied that methodology to the new desk. He found 3 more files that didn't close cleanly. The man who had signed the 2003 confirmation report was retired by the time the internal review reached its conclusions. He was not contacted. His signature was noted in the review document, given appropriate context, and the file moved forward. He had applied the procedure that existed at the time. The procedure had been insufficient. The procedure had since been updated. This is how institutional error is processed when no one is willing to call it what it is. Not negligence, not failure, but a process gap. Something that fell between the standards of its time and the standards that were later developed in response to it. The 8 years during which a living man had operated under the cover of a confirmed death, the financing he had moved, the materials he had helped position, the cells he had supported, were not attributed to the gap in the 2003 report. They were attributed to the target's sophisticated operational security. He was given the credit. The institution absorbed none of the cost. The cigarette butt that started everything was never formally entered into evidence in any proceeding. There is no proceeding. There is no courtroom, no charge, no public record. There is a closed file with a termination report and a separate closed file from 2003 that now carries a review annotation and an updated protocol in a document that will not be declassified for at least 50 years. The physical object, a cigarette filter recovered from a pavement in Beirut in 2011, existed briefly in a sealed evidence pouch, then in a laboratory, then as a data profile in a secure system. It no longer exists in any form that can be examined or questioned. What it produced was a confirmation. What that confirmation produced was an operation. What that operation produced was a dead man, a scattered network, a silent financial system, and a methodology that one analyst carried forward to the next desk, and the next problem, and the next file that didn't close cleanly. The network is still operating. In a different form, under different names, through different channels. It is, by all available intelligence assessments, more resilient now than it was before the operation removed the man who ran it. That detail is in a file somewhere. Whether anyone is sitting with it the way Eitan once sat with a partial fingerprint from a cigarette filter and refused to accept what the system told him it meant, that question doesn't have an answer yet. Hidden Ops covers the operations that intelligence agencies confirm by never fully denying. If you want to understand how the actual architecture of covert work functions, subscribe. New operation every week.